about Icon. We're an Irish multinational, essentially. We started from modest beginnings about 25 years ago in Dublin with only 5 people. Now we've got a global reach right across the globe, running clinical trials with the top tier of the contract research organisations in the world. And our mission is really to deliver, or to accelerate the drug development process to save lives, obviously, and improve quality of life. So, if we look at the clinical trials industry at the moment, it's one of these sort of, I think everyone's aware, it's a sort of unsustainable industry. You know, R&D spending is just going up and up and up, and the number of new entities coming out, new molecules coming out for treatment is actually decreasing. The costs are just getting very, very prohibitive. There's a very complex cycle to, you know, to getting a drug into the marketplace. From the moment a compound is synthesized as a possible candidate in a vast panel of possible candidates, to the point where it actually goes into the market and is being used by patients and by doctors and so on. And apart from the actual the stage as you go through in terms of phase 1, 2 and 3 of clinical trials, even the post-marketing now is becoming, if you like, a lengthy process. Trying to convince payers, convince providers that this particular drug is value for money, is worthwhile, does what it's supposed to do, is better than what's there at the moment, and so on. And it can take, you know, 12 years or so, even just to get the drug onto the market, never mind the post-marketing work that has to be done. And the patent clock is ticking from the moment the drug is, the compound, if you like, is synthesized. And that's a 20-year clock. And it can cost something in the region of $1.5 billion just to create one drug. So you can see where the economics of this are difficult for the industry. People might think the pharma industry is a rich and greedy industry, and maybe it is in some ways. But it also does have very, very important objectives to actually improve quality of life and save lives for people. The last talk was focusing on this demographic of over 65-year-olds, and it's so important to understand that principle that aging, the population is aging generally, particularly in I suppose in the Western world, and with that comes more illness, more disease, and so on. You have to try and treat it and deal with it. So it's very important that we do develop new drugs in this area. And later on, I'll come to talk about CNS research, which is obviously very relevant to that particular population. So, in terms of running clinical trials, you know, patient burden is a very big factor. Traditionally, I suppose, or historically, the patient was treated as something like an object in many ways, a bit like the way medicine used to work, even generally. The patient was simply, you know, passed from pillar to post, and the patient had to go to the hospital for various procedures. That was just tough, and you have to wait around for, you know, 2 hours for consultation. That was tough as well. And I think a couple of speakers today have already focused on this idea that we're now getting more patient-centric. We're now trying to put the focus back on the patient and empower the patient. So we're trying to get around this idea when a patient's involved in a clinical trial, what are the burdens on the patient? How can we improve that burden? A, to get patients into the trial in the first place, and B, to keep them there. The patients participate in clinical trials for all kinds of reasons, not least they actually genuinely want to advance science, and actually even if they might have a condition that is difficult and maybe even possible to treat at this point in time, maybe in the future somebody else will benefit from the trial that they're participating in. Other patients obviously will participate because maybe they think there's a hope for their particular condition, they might get some drug. But either way, there's a limit to a patient's tolerance. You all know yourself, I'm sure you've all experienced of going to hospital, generally speaking, and it can be very arduous to go there and wait around and wait to be seen, and then go through various procedures you have to go through. Well, a clinical trial patient is doing that, you know, on an ongoing basis for quite some time. So the easier you make it, the better for the patient, the better. And in terms of clinical trials, you know, if you don't take care of your patients and don't get them in early and don't keep them there, you will maybe experience, or will most certainly experience, delays in your trial. And that can be as much as, you know, $37,000 a day for every day you lose in a trial. And that's a lot of lost revenue for both a company like ours running the trial or for the pharma company itself. And in extreme cases, it can actually lead to the trial not really succeeding. Not because the drug doesn't work, but because you didn't quite get the correct amount of data through to show the trial, and then you have to do it all again. And that can increase the cost of the trial, obviously. And it's a big factor in CNS research, which again I'll mention later, which makes CNS trials quite difficult to run. So we come to the point of wearables, and to touch on the last talk actually, and wearable technology has been around for a long time. It's not a new thing. You'll see papers from the 1970s talking about wearable technology. And it has, I suppose, although it's been around a long time, it has proliferated recently and has entered the consumer market, and we're all familiar with the Fitbit and those kinds of devices. And it has huge potential now to improve how clinical trials run. So we are looking at this idea of a therapeutic area sensor suite, because you have all these different, some are, strictly speaking, are wearables, activity and sleep monitors you wear. Some might not be what you might call strictly a wearable, like a glucometer, or even an oximetry device where you're just putting it on temporarily to measure something and take it off again. But they are effectively wearable type devices, certainly self-service, certainly things you can give to a patient to use in their own home. And you can build up these suites of sensors to look at different areas like diabetes, cardiovascular, respiratory, and CNS, and so on. And the idea here is that if you start to get a sense of how these might be used in clinical trials, you can change the whole paradigm of how trials work. As I just to in the first talk in this session around virtual reality, this idea of telemedicine combined with wearables can ultimately lead to the point where maybe the trial can take place completely remotely, and the patient may need to very rarely come to the hospital for a procedure. But the true value of these wearables, I suppose you can immediately see the idea that you can measure glucose, you can measure activity, you can measure sleep, and so on. The kind of standard things that these wearables will deliver. But the true value of these wearables, I think, in the future will lie way beyond just that idea of a sensor. And it's this idea of end-to-end capability of seeing, well, in what ways can you use those data? It's not just about the clinical endpoint. It can be to do with early detection and compliance, putting the patient in context, developing digital biomarkers, which is a very exciting area, particularly in CNS research, safety and adaptive trials, and so on. And I'll talk a bit about digital biomarkers later. And this brings me, I suppose, to what are the barriers to the operationalization of wearables? And this is, I suppose, the title of this talk. And up to now, really what I'm introducing to you is just the context for how these wearables can be used. But we have to consider, if we want to get that end-to-end process, and also considering that this is quite a conservative industry, we're using technologies here that have been around a long time, and in other industries are just normal. But in the healthcare industry or in the clinical research industry, they're not that widespread in use because it's a conservative industry for all kinds of good reasons around regulation. But in fact, really, if you look at what the FDA is saying, what the EMA is saying, the regulators actually are probably more open to these things being used than the companies, the pharma companies, and the CROs and all the other actors as such. The FDA wants the industry to be more innovative because these will drive better drug development. So we start looking at the device and the location as the very first start. Is it fit for purpose? We need a medical device, or will a consumer device do, depending on what we're actually trying to measure. And we have to deal with this very nutty problem of uncontrolled conditions. Clinical trial, clinical research is used to the idea that you bring patients into a very controlled environment. It's not perfect, and that's why we have to monitor trials carefully. Not all sites in every situation will carry out their research according to the exact protocol they should be. But nevertheless, there's a perception, probably a reasonable one, that in the hospital environment or the research clinic environment, it's relatively controlled. You see the patient, you can kind of dictate the way in which the patient is being handled and the kind of procedures that are being conducted. As soon as you give the patient full control and say, we're going to put all the devices out there into the home care setting, and let the patient effectively collect data themselves, you run into a lot of fear around control. And that can be just something as innocuous as the patient not really following what they've been told rigorously, which is understandable, particularly if you were trying to ask the patient to do a lot of complex things. I talked a bit about device, the burden on the patient in terms of devices. It's one thing to give a patient, say, a watch to wear on their wrist, but say you want to also give them two or three other devices to collect information. But it gets to the point where the patient is carrying around all these devices. Are you asking the patient to use certain technology in their home? Maybe they have to have internet access, maybe they have to have a smartphone in order to connect up with the rest of the data flow. Is that difficult for someone who's 70 or 80 who doesn't have around technology point of view? And then it can get to more extreme cases where a patient can be asked to, and again, a very simple scenario, wear a watch on the wrist to measure activity, because that's part of the way they're being monitored for the trial. and they decide that their next door neighbour jogs every morning, they'll just give the watch to them instead, you know, because that just collects the data and the patient it gets off doing the activity. You know, I wouldn't call it fraud as such, but you're getting into areas where it is now a great concern for the trial because you're not collecting data properly. So, you know, the full spectrum there of how do you start to put these devices out and use them effectively. And then you move on to the data transfer piece, and you've always got issues around data privacy. Are you using a hub that's supplied, or you have to use an app? If you're using an app, is it the patient's own phone or own device that you're allowing them to use, or do you have to provide the device to them to use? And do you need real-time data? Do you need it coming through all the time? Maybe you're monitoring the patient, not just for clinical endpoints, but maybe even in certain conditions. Maybe you're trying to monitor whether the patient is deteriorating in some way, so you can take action very quickly, depending on the indication that we're looking at. Or is it okay just for the patient to collect lots of data and then bring it to the hospital on a routine basis for download? You know, can we just in that kind of way? If so, you know, does the device have enough battery power? How much data can it store? So you've got all those issues to worry about for data transfer. And then you get the data integration. You've got issues around, you know, using an API directly to connect from some device or hub or app, whatever it might be, into some, you know, onward data storage area. Are you just transferring files around like CSVs? And then when you get the data in, then how are you managing it? You know, from a data management point of view, what kind of data reconciliation do you have to do? You know, what kind of organization do you have around edit checks? The kind of traditional data management that's done for a clinical trial. And also then data standards for analysis. How do we begin to incorporate those kinds of those data from those wearable devices into the more, if you like, traditional clinical data sets? And if we think about wearables and the kind of data they collect, some of those data, or most of those data, are very straightforward. It's simply their clinical endpoints or some kind of endpoint that's being delivered by the device. But if you really want to get into the raw data from these devices, particularly around actigraphy, where these devices can collect data as frequently as every tenth of a second, how do you begin to handle those data, and what kind of standards do you have around those for integrating them into other analysis? So the kind of things we've been doing at ICON, you know, we've been running a series of what you might call back-end proofs of concepts around the technology. We've also been running actual practical examples in the field where we've been helping to deploy wearable devices in clinical trials and seeing how we can work with those data. Because it is happening. I mean, clinical trials are using wearable devices, just not particularly extensively. So you have three broad categories here. You've got the idea of a derived endpoint. This is the most basic one where everyone's familiar, I'm sure, with the idea of a Fitbit giving you the number of steps you've done today and so on. So this is just simply a derived endpoint you're getting through and bringing it into electronic data capture system, and traditionally we can see our clinical data management system. And we have this informatics hub called Iconic in ICON where we do a lot of clinical analysis around the clinical trial. So that's a fairly seamless integration point to bring it through the EDC route. And very often in these cases you're taking data directly off the device, maybe at a hospital setting. But we're also looking at, you know, exploratory endpoints. Can we use what are effectively validated and standard endpoints coming off devices, but maybe using them in a new way and seeing whether they will have relevance for a particular indication. And then finally, the more ambitious one, or the more optimistic one in the future, is this idea of looking at pattern recognition and trying to look in the actual raw data from these devices, particularly around actigraphy, to see can you find something that can now be used as an actual clinical endpoint in its own right. But there's a big bridge to the gap there between, you know, getting that confidence that not only can you use a wearable in a device for some sort of safety monitoring or some sort of exploratory endpoint, but you can actually begin to use wearable devices for actual primary endpoints. And I will touch on this later when I get on to talking about CNS studies. This slide's a bit complicated, but I want to get across to you something we've been doing with a vendor called Validic to help us to capture data from multiple devices totally anonymously in the cloud, but bring them back into, you know, the mainstream clinical analysis within ICON, and that could apply to any country. So what you have here, you're starting on the top right-hand corner. You have here what I would call just a representation of what Iconic is. We have here, you know, subject level data for a clinical trial. We know the demographics, we know their adverse events, their medical history, you know, everything that's been collected on the patient for the trial. It's all in there in our secure system. We can then assign a totally anonymous ID to those subjects, and we provide the subject with this access token that the lytic vendor facilitates, if you like. And the patient uses that access token then, if you come down to this at the circle, to log in essentially to the Validic, what's called the Validic marketplace. And in this Validic marketplace, Validic has linked to all the device vendors it has partnered with and has agreed standards with and terms and so on with. So the patient, I mean, in a very simple example, let's say a patient has a Fitbit, for instance, and we send them the Validic token. They can now log into the Validic marketplace into their own Fitbit account with that token. So the patient is in full control of their own privacy. And they're authorizing effectively Fitbit in this case, or it could be iHealth, or it could be anything else you want to use that's a partner with Validic, to authorize a transfer of their data from that single vendor into the Validic data store over here on the left-hand side. At any time, the patient can go in and take back that information if they want to. So what flows now into the Validic data store is nothing to do with the patient. The data store doesn't understand anything about who the patient is, any of their more personal details that they might have with their individual vendor. All it knows is that patient VU4 had 2,000 steps today, for example. And Validic has built up a very standard data set for the different domains you might expect to capture from wearable devices. And they offer the ability to extend that data standard if you need to in a particular situation. Once it's in the Validic data store, there's a very easy API then that we can use to pull the data using the same kind of token system back into our secure typical data store, where we can now close the loop and match up, patient, VU4 with who we really know the patient to be, which is still somewhat anonymized. In clinical trials, we don't know that patient's name or where they're from, but we do have a very distinct identity on them, their clinical trial number, so to speak. But we also know a lot about them in terms of their clinical profile in the trial. And then we can begin to match the data coming off the wearable device with what we're seeing in their clinical profile. So this is a way of using wearable data, maybe using that wearable data as a way of monitoring something to do with compliance around the patient participation in the trial. There are examples, for example, where say you're running a pain study, could be an arthritis study, and the medication, ideally you hope, is relieving pain in some way. And you're also looking at the patient's activity to see, does it help them be more active because their pain is now relieved. Well, there's a danger that the patient, it's like a kind of a bad feedback cycle. They get pain relief, therefore they think they can be more active. So they start getting more active until they start feeling pain again. But it's just a vicious loop then, because they're maybe damaging themselves and they're not really proving whether the drug really works. It's not intended to make them marathon runners, it's just meant to relieve their pain generally. So you might have a condition in there that says, patients shouldn't have more than a certain amount of activity. And if you start seeing that increased activity, you can intervene in some way. And even the patient themselves, I mean, some of these, I'm talking here, I suppose, again, about how we would monitor clinical trials and run clinical trials, but some of this can also be a very positive message back to the patient. You can give them feedback through their devices to show them how they're doing, and show them that they shouldn't be spending whatever it might be, more than 8,000, 10,000 steps a day. And then let's see, how that affects their pain. So when they're doing their pain score on their diary, and they're saying genuinely, my pain has improved, I'm now okay on a scale of 1 to 10, and my activity levels are kind of normal, you have a much better picture than if you simply let them do whatever they want without really understanding what they're doing. They might be active, they might not be. So this brings me, I'm going to diverge slightly now to this topic. I've been touching on it in the course of the presentation so far, and I will come back a little bit. It'll kind of come full circle again in a way to talk about wearables. So it's a somewhat provocative title, Data Science is Good for Mental Health, and I'm using the word data science in a very liberal way to say the informatics analysis that we do, I'm calling it data science. Or the data integration we do is called data science. And it's mental health because it's about CNS research. So the clinical endpoints for CNS drugs are very difficult to measure. They're usually based on a clinician or patient-reported outcome. So essentially, a patient with Alzheimer's disease comes into a clinic and the doctor has it's a very well-validated, conceived questionnaire to assess that patient's, if you like, Alzheimer's state, or whether they have Alzheimer's at all. But nevertheless, somewhat subjective and relies on the doctor or the rater, as we might call them, following the correct procedure for that particular questionnaire every time they deliver it to get some kind of consistent result. But because that's the only really primary outcome measure for most CNS conditions, CNS trials have a relatively poor success rate. At least I think this is one of the main reasons. And it's really less than half of a non-CNS trial. So it can cost twice as much to deliver a CNS drug. A lot of pharma companies are actually pulling away from CNS research, even though there's a growing disease burden in the population. I think everyone will recognise that there's an increased incidence of Alzheimer's disease, increased instances of depression and so on. And purely from our point of view as an industry, as contract research organisations, it's still a $4 billion plus market out there for doing this kind of research. So it's important for us to think about how we can be more innovative in CNS research. So what was our strategy in terms of our phase 1 strategy for doing this? Was to get into the scales in more detail. How do we do scale analysis? By scale, I mean those clinician-reported outcomes that we're doing. We wanted to improve subject selection. We wanted to monitor score variability of screening. Every trial has a certain band of patients it wants to get in. It sets out these inclusion-exclusion criteria for the patients. In a simple sort of explanation of it, imagine if you're running an Alzheimer's trial, you've got this new drug you think will help Alzheimer's disease. You don't want healthy patients in there because it's not going to affect them. They don't have Alzheimer's disease, so how can it have any effect? And equally, you might want to have people who are severely ill with Alzheimer's disease, because you might say, this drug we know is not going to help those people. They're too far developed in the disease. So we're going to decide we want people with a certain threshold, above which and below which we want in the trial. And that's going to be based on some kind of screening test using one of these instruments like a clinician-reported outcome to get a score for the patient and decide, yes, this patient is under 24, let's say, in terms of score, and therefore they're eligible. But you want good variability too. You don't want to see too many patients being brought in just on the threshold. Perfectly, if you like, legal in terms of protocol, they're within the conditions. But if all your patients are happening there, you have a problem maybe in the trial without having enough variability. And you want to monitor at the site level to make sure that from the start you get the right patients in. You want to look at how the score is varying from visit to visit to see, are the patterns kind of normalish or are they kind of out of the ordinary? Are you seeing jumps around scores that will be unlikely and therefore might point towards some kind of methodological inconsistency? And you want to compare scores, or scales rather, that should be interscale correlation, sorry. Scales that you would expect to correlate, scales that give the same outcome, but maybe they're not. The doctor's giving two different scales and they're not giving the same outcome. One scale says the patient's getting better, the other scale says the patient's getting worse. And that will happen. There's nothing on the odd occasion that will happen, but if it's happening consistently at a particular site or with a particular clinician, maybe there's something you need to look into. And obviously also monitor whether all these assessments are being completed. So the subject may be visiting the hospital on schedule every time. They're not just going there for these questionnaires to be delivered, they're having other medical interventions. Is every single test, every single thing that has to happen, is it happening? Because if you're missing too many of those questionnaires, that can be a problem. And I suppose to put it in context too, some of these questionnaires can be, and because of the nature of the patients, they can be quite, I won't say traumatic, but they can be difficult experiences for the doctor and for the patient. Someone with Huntington's disease coming in to go through a bank of motor tests and mental tests can be a little bit exhausting for someone in that position, and that also makes it difficult for the doctor to deal with. So if you've got a hard day at the hospital where a patient's been going around banks and banks of tests and consultations, and it gets to the end of the day, and it probably shouldn't arrive at this point, because perhaps the more difficult things should be done first. The doctor might say, look, I'm not going to put the patient through this test this time around because they've had enough today. It won't really hurt the trial just to miss this once. And maybe it won't, but if that becomes a consistent pattern, you can end up with that patient's data just not being good enough to include in the trial, and you may have wasted your time even running the trial if that happens too much. So what does a ClinRow look like? Just to give you a sense of what we have to do. This is an example of an Alzheimer's ClinRow. It's a series of questions, and you just ask the patient these questions, you get answers, you put them through various tests, and then you basically score them off. And they can be quite complex like this one. The ADS-COG is quite a complex one, where there are rules around this. Some of these questions you ask more than once, maybe 2 or 3 times to take the average score. Some have these weird rules around if the score is, say, greater than 12, that's you divide by 2, if it's less than 12, you take it. They can have weird rules around them. Other scales can be simply sum of the scores, and there's no problem. So we had to cope with this, and also the fact that the variables coming through for any given scale, because there are lots of these scales. I mean, here's an example of some CNS diseases. I've just put a spattering of the scales. I mean, I'm not, they're just acronyms really, but just to get a sense, there's a huge landscape out there of questionnaires and scales and conditions we're working with. And we have to be able to allow for all of those. So how do we do all this? This is what I decided how to manage it. How do we do all this with all those different scales? Well, we have this scales rule engine in our informatics system to sum those rules, translate where necessary, text into numbers, and then develop key risk indicator definitions and thresholds. And we do this all through a self-service system whereby the study team is now set up. Once the system's in place, the study team can define all those rules around any particular scale. So we take on a new indication, we can put the scales into the system, and it will be defined by the study team, and then use them each of the analysis for all those reasons. But phase 2 is to start using more objective data. So let's use actigraphy data. Recently, in Parkinson's, a company we're working with has developed an actigraphy measure that covers some of the Parkinson's scale, not all of it. So you can't replace the Parkinson's scale, but you can begin to bring in these actigraphy data to help cross-validate whether the scale is being consistent. So you're doing a correlation again. Is the actigraphy part of the scale that we're doing consistent with the more traditional questionnaire? Digital biomarkers is a big thing we want to try and develop, in the future. The idea that instead of looking at a questionnaire for Parkinson's, you can actually begin to monitor the actual tremors in someone's body, and that's a signature for Parkinson's, and you can actually show the drug is having an effect on an actual signature for that disease. And obviously around compliance and patient burden, which I touched on earlier, all these things will help to create a more objective trial, and where you find out how things are happening earlier, and you can intervene as necessary. This is the kind of stuff we've been doing. This is a very simple example of how you might do digital fingerprinting. This top chart here is very detailed, 100 Hz data from an actigraphy device, just typical evening for somebody doing all kinds of stuff, but including brushing their teeth 4 times.